On a wooded hilltop just outside the small city of Morganton, North Carolina, a red brick building rises above the tree line, its long, symmetrical wings stretching out like the arms of something patient, something that has been waiting a very long time to be understood. This is Broughton Hospital. It has stood on this hill since 1883, when it opened its doors as the Western North Carolina Insane Asylum. For more than a century, it has treated the mentally ill, weathered scandal and reform, expanded and contracted with the tides of American psychiatry, and quietly become one of the most storied institutional sites in the American South. Today, ask people in Morganton about Broughton, and you will hear two very different stories. You will hear about a working hospital, a major employer, a place where real people receive real psychiatric care to this day. And you will also hear something else. Whispers of ghost stories, of screaming heard on the wind, of a cursed hilltop where the dead supposedly outnumber the living. Local legend has done what local legend always does with old asylums. It has wrapped the building in the language of hauntings, painted its history in the colors of horror movies, and turned real human suffering into campfire entertainment. But the true story of Broughton Hospital does not need ghosts. It does not need curses or hauntings to be unsettling. Its actual documented history of ambition and underfunding, of genuine care and catastrophic overcrowding, of reform born from public exposure, is disturbing enough on its own terms. This is a building that was designed with real optimism, built to embody the best psychiatric ideas of its era, and then, over decades, pushed past its limits by forces far larger than any one administrator or physician could control. So the question this documentary sets out to answer is not, is Broughton Hospital haunted? It is a harder and more important question. How did an institution built to provide humane care for the mentally ill become, at points in its history, a symbol of overcrowding, neglect, and documented abuse? And what does the surviving architecture on that Morganton hilltop still tell us about the answer? Consider, for a moment, what the building itself represents. It was not thrown up cheaply or thoughtlessly. It was designed by one of the most experienced asylum architects in the country, built according to a specific and deeply considered theory of how physical space could influence mental health, and funded, however inadequately, by a state legislature that genuinely believed it was solving a humanitarian crisis. Nothing about its origin suggests malice or indifference, and that, in a strange way, is exactly what makes its later history so worth examining closely. This was not a story of an institution designed to fail. It was a story of an institution slowly, gradually, and almost invisibly outgrowing the very ideals it had been built to embody. To understand that, we have to go back before the hospital existed at all, to a moment when North Carolina did not have nearly enough room for the people it was supposed to be caring for. The story of Broughton Hospital begins not in Morganton, but roughly 90 miles east, in the state capital of Raleigh. In the 1840s, North Carolina had no public institution dedicated to the care of the mentally ill at all. Families with a relative suffering from severe mental illness had few options beyond keeping that person at home, placing them in a local poorhouse, or, in the worst cases, confining them in a jail alongside criminals. Not because they had committed a crime, but because society had nowhere else to put them. Governor John Motley Moorhead pushed in the 1840s for the creation of a state-run asylum, but his early efforts were rebuffed by the General Assembly. It took the arrival of a formidable outside advocate to change the political calculus. Dorothea Dix, the reformer whose national crusade for humane treatment of the mentally ill reshaped psychiatric care across the United States, petitioned the North Carolina legislature directly, appealing to lawmakers to fund a hospital built specifically for the treatment, not merely the confinement, of people with mental illness. Her advocacy worked. The legislature passed the enabling bill, and in 1856, the institution that would come to be known as Dorothea Dix Hospital opened its doors in Raleigh, becoming North Carolina's first public hospital for the mentally ill. For a time, Dix Hospital represented genuine progress. But North Carolina's population was growing, and so was the number of people the state was legally and morally obligated to care for. By the 1870s, Dix Hospital was badly overcrowded, its wards filled well beyond the numbers its architecture had ever been designed to hold. State legislators increasingly recognized that a single asylum, however well run, could not serve the entire state, particularly not the mountainous western counties, whose residents faced a long and difficult journey simply to reach Raleigh. The push for a second institution found its champions in the state Senate. Joseph C. Mills, a senator from Burke County, who sat on the Senate Committee on Insane Asylums, led the effort, working alongside fellow legislator Samuel McDowell Tate. Their advocacy paid off. On March 20th, 1875, the North Carolina General Assembly voted to appropriate $75,000 for the construction of a second state asylum, one that would finally bring psychiatric care within reach of the western half of the state. By that point, the scale of unmet need in the state was becoming difficult to ignore. Estimates from the period suggested that as many as 700 North Carolinians classified as mentally ill were living without access to any proper institutional care at all, scattered across poorhouses, private homes, and in the worst cases, county jails never designed or equipped to provide anything resembling treatment. $75,000 was, even by the standards of 1875, a modest sum for a project of this ambition, and that initial underfunding would set a pattern the institution would struggle against for the rest of the 19th century and well into the 20th. The only question left was where exactly that hospital would be built. Once the legislature committed to building a second asylum, 4 western North Carolina towns entered the competition to host it: Statesville, Hickory, Asheville, and Morganton. Each offered its own case for why the new institution belonged within its borders. In the end, Morganton, and Burke County more broadly, won out, largely because of its central position within the western half of the state, a location that would make the hospital reasonably accessible to the many mountain counties it was meant to serve. The site selected for construction sat on a hilltop just outside the town, eventually encompassing 283 acres of land. The choice of a hilltop setting was not incidental. 19th century asylum planners, drawing on the reform ideas that had swept American psychiatric architecture at mid-century, believed strongly in the therapeutic value of setting, light, air circulation, and separation from the noise and moral disorder of urban life. A commanding hilltop position overlooking open countryside fit squarely within that philosophy. Patients were to be surrounded by calm, by natural beauty, by a landscape thought to soothe rather than agitate the mind. The new institution took the name Western North Carolina Insane Asylum, and to design its central building, the state turned to a Philadelphia architect with a national reputation in the field, Samuel Sloan. Sloan was retained specifically because of his extensive experience designing hospitals for the mentally ill, and his selection signaled that North Carolina intended this to be no ordinary public building. It was meant to be a serious, modern, purpose-built asylum constructed according to the leading psychiatric architectural theory of the day. Construction, however, did not go smoothly. The contract for building the massive structure was let in 1875 to Wilmington contractor James Walker, who took on the role of master builder, overseeing the enormous and complex project. But money proved to be the recurring obstacle. Appropriations lagged through the late 1870s, construction slowed to a crawl, and by 1882, Governor Thomas Jarvis felt compelled to publicly urge renewed attention and funding for the stalled asylum. Construction that had begun in the mid-1870s would, in fact, still be incomplete when the institution was forced to open its doors in 1883. A detail that says a great deal about how urgently the hospital was needed and how far the state's ambitions had outpaced its willingness or ability to pay for them. To understand what made the Western North Carolina Insane Asylum architecturally significant, it helps to understand who Samuel Sloan was and what he believed a mental hospital should be. Born in Chester County, Pennsylvania in 1815, Sloan trained as a carpenter before establishing himself as an architect in Philadelphia by 1850. Within a decade, he had built a national reputation, publishing influential pattern books on residential and institutional design and taking on major commissions across the eastern United States. He became particularly known for his work on hospitals for the mentally ill, eventually designing roughly 20 such institutions over the course of his career, most of them built according to a specific architectural philosophy known as the Kirkbride Plan. The Kirkbride plan, developed by psychiatrist Thomas Story Kirkbride, was more than a floor plan. It was an argument expressed in brick and mortar about how architecture itself could heal. Kirkbride buildings were organized around a central administrative section, from which long wings extended outward in a stepped, staggered arrangement, each successive wing set slightly back from the one before it. This layout allowed administrators to separate patients by the severity of their condition and by sex, while still giving every ward access to sunlight, cross-ventilation, and views of the surrounding grounds, features Kirkbride and his followers considered essential to what the era called moral treatment, the belief that a humane, orderly, aesthetically calming environment could itself contribute to a patient's recovery. It is worth dwelling for a moment on just how sincerely this philosophy was held by its 19th century proponents. Kirkbride and the physicians who followed his model were reacting against an earlier era of psychiatric care defined by chains, isolation cells, and outright neglect. To them, a building like the one rising on the Morganton hilltop was not merely a container for patients, it was itself a form of treatment, a piece of medical equipment built at the scale of architecture. Every design decision, from the staggered wings to the placement of windows, was meant to serve a therapeutic purpose. Reducing noise and overstimulation for the most severely ill patients housed farthest from the center, while allowing calmer patients closer access to shared administrative and social spaces. Whatever this philosophy's later limitations, it represented a genuine, good faith attempt to translate emerging psychiatric theory into physical form. Sloane's design for the Morganton Asylum embodied this philosophy at an imposing scale. The central building he designed featured a dramatic 3-story portico facing northwest, its lower level framed by paired Roman Doric columns set on pedestals, its second level ringed by Corinthian columns, and its uppermost level marked not by columns at all, but by a row of paired decorative urns, a flourish that gave the building a distinctly grand, almost civic monumentality, more befitting a state capitol than a hospital ward. From that central mass, 7 3.5-story wings and crosswings extended outward in the classic Kirkbride stepped arrangement, each wing falling back from the next, creating a structure whose full footprint dwarfed almost anything else in the region. This was not simply a building, it was intended to function as a nearly self-contained institutional world. Within its walls and across its grounds, the asylum would eventually need to house patients, treat them, feed them, clothe them, employ its staff, and manage its own infrastructure, all largely independent of the town below. The symmetry and scale of Sloane's design reflected that ambition, a controlled, orderly environment where architecture itself was meant to impose calm on chaos. However imperfectly, that ideal would ultimately be realized in practice. But the building's construction history tells a more complicated story than its finished elevation suggests. Chronic underfunding meant that when money ran out in 1883, only the central section and one wing had actually been completed. And that partial structure filled with patients almost immediately upon opening before it was ever finished. Samuel Sloane did not live to see his Morganton Asylum completed. He died unexpectedly on July 19, 1884, reportedly of sunstroke, while working in Raleigh on another major North Carolina commission, the state's executive mansion. Responsibility for finishing the Morganton building fell to his young assistant, Adolphus Gustavus Bauer, a German immigrant architect who had come to North Carolina the previous year specifically to work under Sloane. Bauer designed the asylum's north wing, which was constructed and completed by October 1886, effectively finishing the vision his mentor had not lived to see through. Bauer would go on to a substantial independent career of his own, designing other prominent North Carolina buildings before his own early death in 1898. The finished complex, central building, original wing, and Bauer's north wing, along with the many structures added to the campus in the decades that followed, would eventually be recognized for its architectural and historical significance. The core building and the wider campus around it later became part of what is now known as the Broughton Hospital Historic District, a designation that speaks to just how much of this 19th century institutional vision has physically survived into the present day. There is a certain irony worth noting here, one that recurs throughout Broughton's history. The building's grandest architectural gestures, the layered classical columns, the monumental portico, the carefully staggered symmetry of the wings, were completed under conditions of chronic financial strain, patched together across more than a decade by two different architects working under two different governors. The finished structure looks from a distance like the product of a single, unified vision confidently executed. Up close, its construction history tells a far messier story. Stalled budgets, a master builder pressed into service as project manager, an architect who died before his design was finished, and a young assistant who inherited the job of completing someone else's unfinished masterpiece. That tension between polished appearance and difficult underlying reality would in many ways come to define the entire institution for the century that followed. Despite the building's unfinished state, the Western North Carolina Insane Asylum opened its doors on March 29, 1883. The first patient was admitted that day, and shortly afterward, approximately 100 patients arrived by rail, transferred from the badly overcrowded Dix Hospital in Raleigh, a direct physical illustration of exactly the problem the new asylum had been built to solve. Over the institution's first 2 years of operation, 252 patients were received and treated, filling the still incomplete building far faster than construction crews could finish it. Overseeing this chaotic, promising beginning was the asylum's first superintendent, Dr. Patrick Livingston Murphy. Murphy's leadership would come to define the institution's early character. Almost immediately, he confronted the gap between the hospital's mission and its physical capacity. In his first biennial report to the General Assembly in 1884, Murphy wrote plainly about the crisis already forming, noting that there were mentally ill people in the district the asylum served who needed care but simply could not be accommodated. It was a warning that would prove prophetic for the institution's entire history. Demand for care would, again and again, outpace the state's willingness or ability to fund the space required to provide it. The General Assembly responded to Murphy's appeal, authorizing funds to complete a north wing of what became known as the Avery Building, adding space for roughly 150 more patients when it opened in 1886. The following year, 1887, saw the opening of another structure, the Scroggs Building, further expanding the asylum's capacity. Bed space, which had started well under 300, had by the mid-1880s expanded to accommodate more than 500 patients, a rapid growth curve that would only accelerate in the decades to come. Dr. Murphy remained superintendent of the institution for nearly a quarter of a century, guiding it through its formative expansion until his death in 1907. Under his tenure, the hospital grew from a single unfinished building into a sprawling institutional campus, and it is to that broader campus and the world it created on the Morganton hilltop that we turn next. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the Morganton Asylum grew far beyond Samuel Sloan's original Kirkbride plan building. What had begun as a single grand structure gradually became something closer to a self-sufficient small town. Additional patient wards, staff residences, agricultural buildings, and mechanical and support structures spread across an ever-expanding campus. By 1893, the total acreage of the grounds had grown to roughly 331 acres, and the hospital continued to acquire additional land in the years that followed, including a tract purchased in 1900 near Hunting Creek Bridge. Much of the early physical expansion of the grounds was accomplished using the labor of the patients themselves. Male patients worked to build and maintain roads across the property, including a road connecting the hospital directly to the town of Morganton below. This labor reflected the broader 19th century philosophy of moral treatment, which held that structured occupation, physical work, routine, purposeful activity was itself therapeutic, a way of restoring order and dignity to minds the era believed had been thrown into disorder. That philosophy found its fullest expression in what became known as the hospital's colony system, which developed significantly by the early 20th century. Rather than confining every patient to the central ward buildings, the institution began housing certain patients in smaller farmhouse-style buildings scattered across the property, organized around agricultural and outdoor work. Patients in the colony system worked in vineyards, tended orchards, and labored in greenhouses, alongside broader campus agricultural operations that came to include working farms, gardens, a dairy operation, and additional greenhouse space. The campus even developed recreational amenities, an airing court, a summer house built for female patients, a bowling alley and billiard room, and, by 1900, a golf course near the farm colony, used by both patients and staff alike. It would be a mistake to view this expansion purely through a nostalgic lens, as though farm labor and gardens made the asylum a benign or idyllic place. These programs existed within, and were inseparable from, a much larger system of institutional confinement, one in which patients had little or no legal power to leave, to refuse labor, or to challenge the conditions of their treatment. The colony system reflected genuine contemporary belief in the therapeutic value of purposeful work, but it also served the hospital's own practical needs. Patient labor helped feed, clothe, and maintain an institution that state funding never quite kept pace with. Understanding Broughton's history requires holding both of these truths simultaneously, that many of these programs were sincerely intended as treatment, and that they operated inside a system of confinement whose residents had few rights and even less say in their own daily lives. By the early 20th century, the campus had effectively become a working agricultural operation as much as a medical facility. Dairy cattle grazed pastures maintained by patient labor. Greenhouses supplied produce for the hospital's own kitchens. The bakehouse turned out bread for a population that, within a few decades, would number in the thousands. None of this infrastructure was accidental. It reflected the practical reality that an institution this large, sitting on the edge of a small mountain town, essentially had to feed and sustain itself. The hospital was, in a very literal economic sense, a small, self-sufficient town organized entirely around the task of institutional care. Its farms and workshops functioning less like charming period detail and more like the load-bearing infrastructure that kept the entire enterprise financially viable. By the turn of the century, the hospital had become something close to its own self-contained world on that Morganton hilltop, a village unto itself, with its own economy, its own labor force, its own rules. And that self-contained world was about to be tested by a population growth it was never adequately funded to absorb. The early decades of the 20th century brought a version of the same pattern that had defined the hospital's very founding. Demand for psychiatric care in North Carolina kept climbing, and the state's willingness to fund adequate capacity kept falling behind it. The service area for what was by then known as the State Hospital at Morganton had already been expanded multiple times in the institution's first 2 decades as the boundaries of the western district it served were pushed further east to absorb population the Raleigh institution could no longer accommodate. By May of 1899, that eastern boundary had shifted to include the western edges of counties like Durham, Chatham, Harnett, Cumberland, and Robeson, meaning Morganton's asylum was now responsible for a vastly larger population than the one it had originally been built to serve. Physical expansion continued in fits and starts through the early 20th century. New wards, new outbuildings, new dormitory space for staff. But construction rarely kept pace with the growing number of patients being admitted. The result was a slow, grinding tightening of conditions across the institution. Staff found themselves managing more patients with roughly the same physical infrastructure, and the working conditions inside the hospital grew correspondingly more difficult. Historical records from this period paint a stark picture of the strain placed on medical staff specifically. By the 1920s, the ratio of patients to physicians at the hospital had reportedly reached roughly 300 to 1. An extraordinary caseload for any physician attempting to provide individualized psychiatric care. And the situation did not improve. If anything, it worsened. By the 1930s, that ratio had climbed further still to an estimated 500 patients for every physician on staff. Numbers like these make clear that, whatever the intentions of the hospital's leadership, the basic arithmetic of care had become almost impossible to sustain. No amount of dedication or professional skill could allow a single physician to meaningfully evaluate, treat, and monitor 500 patients. Nursing and attendant staff faced similarly grueling conditions. Work hours were long, time off was scarce, and for much of this period, attendants and nurses slept in the very same wards as the patients they were responsible for overseeing, a practice that continued until further expansion in the 1940s finally allowed for separate staff housing. It was a period defined less by any single dramatic incident than by a slow, cumulative institutional strain, the kind of chronic, structural overcrowding that rarely makes headlines in the moment, but that quietly erodes the quality of care a hospital is able to provide year after year after year. The hospital did maintain a training program throughout much of this period that speaks to its ongoing efforts to professionalize its workforce even under difficult conditions. A nursing school operated on the Broughton campus from 1895 until 1962, training generations of nurses who would go on to staff the hospital's wards, and in 1908, a dedicated nurses' home was constructed to house them. This detail matters because it complicates any narrative that reduces the institution's staff to indifferent or uncaring figures. Broughton was, throughout this period, actively investing in professional training and formal nursing education, even as the sheer scale of patient population growth continued to outpace whatever gains that professionalization could produce. Skilled, dedicated staff and systemic understaffing are not mutually exclusive. Both were simultaneously true at Morganton for much of the early 20th century. That erosion was about to reach its breaking point. By the 1940s, the strain that had been building for decades reached a scale that is difficult to fully comprehend today. According to historical accounts of the institution, the hospital's total patient census had climbed above 3,500 individuals, a staggering figure for a facility whose original Kirkbride-style building had been designed at the turn of the century to house a small fraction of that number. This was not overcrowding in some abstract statistical sense. It was thousands of human beings crowded into wards, dormitories, and buildings that had never been designed, funded, or staffed to accommodate a population anywhere near that size. It is important to be precise here about where responsibility actually lay. This was not a story of malicious individuals inventing cruelty for its own sake. It was, overwhelmingly, a story of systemic failure, a structural mismatch between the scale of the mental health crisis North Carolina faced and the resources the state was willing to commit to addressing it. Physicians, nurses, and attendants worked long hours under grueling conditions, frequently outnumbered by patients at ratios that made genuinely individualized psychiatric care close to impossible. Whatever their personal intentions, staff members were operating within a system that had been stretched structurally past its breaking point. The consequences of that structural failure were nonetheless real and severe for the patients living through it. An institution that had been founded on the 19th century promise of moral treatment, of dignity, individual attention, calm surroundings, and purposeful activity, found itself, under the sheer weight of population growth, drifting towards something closer to custodial containment. Individualized treatment plans became increasingly difficult to maintain when a single physician might be nominally responsible for hundreds of patients. Wards built for privacy and calm became crowded common spaces. The gap between the hospital's founding ideals and its lived daily reality had never been wider. It is worth pausing here to emphasize what this documentary is not doing. It is not treating the patients themselves as sources of horror or fear, in the way so many pop culture depictions of old asylums tend to do. The people confined at the state hospital at Morganton during this period were not monsters, and their presence there is not the frightening part of this story. The frightening part, the part with actual documentary evidence behind it, is what the institution, under overwhelming systemic pressure, sometimes failed to provide them: adequate staffing, adequate space, and adequate individualized care. That distinction matters enormously, and it is about to be confirmed not by rumor or legend, but by the reporting of working journalists. It is also worth remembering that Morganton was not unique in this respect. Across the country, The same basic pattern was repeating itself in state after state. Large centralized asylums built in the optimistic reform era of the 19th century, straining under population growth that far outpaced the Great Depression era and wartime budgets available to expand them. The 1930s and early 1940s were, nationally, a low point for American psychiatric institutions generally, a period during which the gap between the founding ideals of moral treatment and the lived reality of underfunded, overcrowded custodial care had widened almost everywhere. What set Morganton apart was not the severity of its problems relative to its peers, but what happened next. The public exposure that forced those problems into the open. If there is a single turning point in Broughton Hospital's history, the moment where the slow, grinding institutional strain of the previous decades finally broke into public view. It came in 1942. That year, a series of investigative newspaper stories brought to public light specific allegations of abuse and severely inadequate conditions inside what was then still known as the State Hospital at Morganton. This is not folklore. It is not a campfire legend passed down through generations of ghost tours. It is documented, verifiable journalism, cited today even by the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources in its own official history of the site, reporting that named real, specific problems at a real, specific moment in time. The exact revelations detailed by these 1942 reports centered on the consequences of the overcrowding and understaffing that had been building for decades. Conditions inside the hospital that fell well short of what patients were owed, and treatment of vulnerable people that failed to meet even the standards of the era. The reporting did what investigative journalism is meant to do. It forced a private institutional failure into public accountability. State officials could no longer treat the hospital's overcrowding as a quiet, internal administrative problem to be managed without outside scrutiny. The stories generated public pressure, and that pressure led directly to a formal investigation into conditions at the hospital, followed by concrete reforms. This moment deserves particular emphasis for one crucial reason. It represents the difference between Broughton's real, documented history and the far murkier, largely unsubstantiated, haunted asylum narratives that circulate online and on ghost tours today. Claims about supernatural activity at Broughton rest on rumor, atmosphere, and the assumption that any old psychiatric hospital must be haunted simply by virtue of being old and psychiatric. The 1942 investigation rests on something entirely different. Named newspapers, published reporting, and a documented governmental response. One of these things is verifiable history. The other is not. The reforms that followed the 1942 expose did not instantly transform the institution. Systemic problems built up over 60 years do not disappear in a single legislative session, and the underlying challenge of underfunding relative to patient population would continue to shape the hospital for years afterward. But the investigation marked a genuine before and after in how the state and the public understood what was happening on that Morganton hilltop. It forced accountability into a system that had, for decades, largely been allowed to operate outside of public view. And it set the stage for a broader transformation in how North Carolina, and the country as a whole, would come to think about the treatment of mental illness in the decades that followed. It is also worth noting that public scrutiny of North Carolina's state psychiatric hospitals did not end in the 1940s and stay ended. Decades later, in the 21st century, the hospital system that Morganton belongs to again drew the attention of outside oversight bodies, including federal civil rights investigators examining conditions and treatment practices across North Carolina's state-operated psychiatric facilities. That later scrutiny is a separate chapter from the 1942 story, rooted in different concerns and a different regulatory era entirely, but it underscores an important continuity. Institutions built to care for society's most vulnerable citizens require ongoing, active oversight, not a single moment of reform followed by permanent assumption of good conduct. The 1942 investigation was not a one-time fix that solved Broughton's structural challenges forever. It was the first documented instance of a pattern that would recur, in different forms, across the institution's subsequent history. Public accountability functioning as a necessary recurring check on an institution that, left entirely to its own devices, had repeatedly shown itself capable of drifting toward crisis. The years following the 1942 investigation coincided with a broader national reckoning over the state of psychiatric institutions across the United States. Journalistic exposés, changing medical science, and shifting public attitudes were, throughout the mid-20th century, gradually eroding the old model of large centralized custodial asylums, the very model that had produced institutions like the one on the Morganton hilltop in the first place. At Broughton, this shift manifested in concrete institutional changes over the ensuing decades. The hospital expanded its educational programming for patients, broadened recreational offerings, and incorporated religious services more fully into institutional life, modest but meaningful steps toward treating patients as individuals with lives, needs, and identities beyond their diagnoses, rather than simply managing a population within a fixed physical footprint. These changes reflected evolving psychiatric thinking about what genuine treatment, rather than mere containment, should look like. At the same time, North Carolina, like most states, began building out an entirely different infrastructure for mental health care, community-based treatment centers and outpatient services designed to catch and treat people closer to home, rather than funneling every case of serious mental illness into a handful of enormous, centralized state hospitals. Broughton itself became connected to this new approach, developing affiliations with local community mental health centers as part of a statewide effort to shift care outward, away from strict institutional confinement. It is worth being precise about what this transition actually was, and was not. It is tempting, when telling this kind of story, to reach for a tidy narrative in which the old asylum simply closed, and mental health care moved on to better things. That is not what happened at Broughton, and it is not really what happened nationally either. Deinstitutionalization was a gradual, uneven, decades-long process, driven by a mix of genuine reform, new psychiatric medications that made outpatient treatment more viable, and, less admirably, cost-cutting pressures that sometimes left community systems underfunded and unable to absorb the patients the old asylums had once housed. Broughton did not close its doors. It changed. Its population declined from its overcrowded mid-century peak, its programs diversified, and its role within the state's mental health system evolved. But the hospital itself remained standing and remained operational, even as the institutional model that had originally produced it fell out of favor across the country. This gradual national shift was itself made possible by developments well beyond Morganton's hilltop. The introduction of new psychiatric medications during the 1950s and 1960s, including early antipsychotic drugs, gave physicians tools that simply had not existed during the overcrowding crisis of the 1930s and 1940s. Medications capable of managing symptoms that had previously required, in the thinking of the era, indefinite institutional confinement. As these tools became more widely available, the calculus that had driven so much of the century's overcrowding began, slowly, to change. Patients who might once have spent years or decades within Broughton's wards could increasingly be stabilized and, in some cases, discharged to community-based care. That medical shift, more than any single piece of legislation or news expose, was what ultimately allowed institutions like Broughton to step back from the population extremes of the mid-20th century. By 1973, this evolving institution reached a symbolic milestone. On March 28th of that year, Broughton Hospital received its first survey by the Joint Commission on Accreditation of Healthcare Organizations, earning a 1-year accreditation. External, professional confirmation that the hospital had moved into a new era of formal, monitored clinical standards, a world away from the largely unsupervised overcrowding of the 1930s and 1940s. Throughout these decades of institutional transformation, the hospital's name changed twice, and each change tells its own small story about how the institution and the broader culture around it understood mental illness at different points in time. The first change came in 1890, just 7 years after the hospital opened, when its original name, the Western North Carolina Insane Asylum, was formally replaced by State Hospital at Morganton. This shift reflected a broader movement in American institutional language during the late 19th century, as terms like asylum and insane, with their harsh and stigmatizing connotations, gradually began giving way to more clinical, less loaded terminology. The state hospital at Morganton name would remain in use for nearly 70 years. The second and final renaming came in 1959, when the institution took on the name it still carries today, Broughton Hospital. The name honored former North Carolina Governor J. Melville Broughton, who had served as the state's chief executive from 1941 to 1945, years that notably overlapped directly with the aftermath of the 1942 investigation and the reform era that followed it. Naming the hospital after a governor associated with that period of accountability and change carried its own quiet, symbolic weight, even if the renaming itself came more than a decade after Broughton's governorship had ended. Taken together, these two name changes trace a clear arc. From the blunt, clinical yet stigmatizing language of the 1880s, insane asylum, to the more neutral institutional phrasing of the 1890s, state hospital, to a name honoring an individual public servant rather than describing the population served at all. It is a small linguistic history, but it mirrors the much larger transformation happening inside the hospital's walls during those same decades. A slow, halting movement away from confinement and towards something closer to modern medical care. Today, Broughton Hospital is one of 3 regional psychiatric hospitals operated by the state of North Carolina under its Division of State-Operated Healthcare Facilities, alongside sister institutions serving the central and eastern parts of the state. A modern echo of the exact same logic that justified building a second asylum back in 1875, that no single centralized facility could adequately serve a population spread across a state as large and geographically varied as North Carolina. In that sense, the 3-hospital regional system in place today is a direct institutional descendant of the argument Joseph C. Mills and Samuel McDowell Tate made to the General Assembly a century and a half ago. While the story of Broughton's medical and social history is one of institutional struggle and gradual reform, it runs in parallel with an entirely different kind of story. One about the preservation of a genuinely significant piece of American architectural history. The hospital's importance is not purely medical or social. The surviving 19th century buildings on that Morganton hilltop represent one of the more intact examples of Kirkbride plan asylum architecture still standing in the United States. That significance has been formally recognized twice by federal preservation authorities. In 1977, the original main building, Samuel Sloan's central structure, along with its earliest wings, was added to the National Register of Historic Places under its historic name, the Western North Carolina Insane Asylum. This recognition placed the building alongside the country's other most architecturally and historically significant structures, protecting it as a documented artifact of 19th century institutional design philosophy. A decade later, in 1987, that protection was expanded significantly. The broader Broughton Hospital Historic District was added to the National Register, encompassing roughly 337 acres of the campus. A designation covering not just Sloan's original central building, but the constellation of structures built up around it across more than a century of institutional growth. The district includes buildings representing multiple distinct architectural periods and styles, from Sloan's original Kirkbride-influenced design through later colonial revival additions to Art Deco-era structures reflecting the campus's continued expansion well into the 20th century. Taken together, the district functions almost as a physical timeline. Walking its grounds means walking through more than 100 years of shifting ideas about what a psychiatric hospital should look like, and what kind of environment was thought to promote healing. This dual recognition, architectural on one hand and encompassing the site's broader social history on the other, reflects something important about how historians and preservationists have come to understand institutions like Broughton. The buildings matter not despite their difficult history, but partly because of it. They are physical evidence of how seriously 19th century reformers took the relationship between architecture and mental health treatment, and simultaneously, physical evidence of how badly that ambitious vision could strain and fracture under the pressures of underfunding and population growth. Preserving the buildings means preserving both halves of that story. Architectural historians who study North Carolina's institutional buildings have specifically pointed to Broughton's main building as one of the state's most complete surviving examples of Samuel Sloan's late career work. A designer whose portfolio, by the time of his death in 1884, included roughly 20 psychiatric hospitals built across the eastern United States, only a fraction of which survive today in anything close to their original form. Many Kirkbride plan asylums elsewhere in the country have been demolished, dramatically altered, or left to deteriorate past the point of meaningful preservation. That the Morganton building has survived largely intact, its original portico and stepped wings still legible more than a century after Bauer completed construction, makes it a genuinely rare architectural resource. Not merely a regional curiosity, but a documented piece of the national history of psychiatric institutional design. It would be easy, at this point in the story, to assume that Broughton Hospital eventually followed the path of so many other historic American asylums. Abandonment, decay, an empty campus left to crumble and become fodder for urban explorers and ghost hunters. That assumption would be wrong. Broughton Hospital did not close. It remains, as of today, an operating psychiatric hospital continuing to serve the same fundamental purpose it was built for in 1883, albeit through methods, medications, and standards of care that would be almost unrecognizable to Dr. Patrick Livingston Murphy and his 19th century staff. The hospital is administered by the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services through its Division of Mental Health, Developmental Disabilities, and Substance Abuse Services, and continues to serve the western portion of the state, historically cited as the westernmost 37 counties, a region home to well over 3 million people, representing more than a third of North Carolina's entire population. The scale of the campus itself has continued to grow across its long history. The hospital's current footprint spans some 460 acres of pasture and farmland, encompassing roughly 67 separate buildings, a physical record of 140 years of continuous institutional expansion, layered one era on top of another.